The king died not from pills, but from a poison called perfectionism, which became the catapult to his death. Elvis Presley was a tyrant. He could fire a musician earning $10,000 a week just because they looked the wrong way on stage or a note wasn't played as he desired. This was not genius, but a psychological catastrophe in a golden cage. Today you will see how $2 million in debt to Colonel Tom Parker turned Elvis into a financial hostage, forcing him to squeeze the perfect sound out of others to justify his own captivity, and how 149 hits on the Billboard Hot 100 were achieved at the cost of broken careers and humiliated professionals. Warning: if you think you know the story of Elvis, prepare for a shock. We will reveal 10 undeniable proofs that his perfectionism was a tool of destruction, forged by his entourage. We are starting right now. Proof 1. The one wrong look, principle, and the betrayal of loyalty. Imagine, you're the best session musician in the world. You're on stage with the king, and your salary is a dream. But one wrong move, and your career turns to ashes. Elvis demanded absolute, blind loyalty, which often bordered on subservience. His perfectionism was merely a cover for paranoia. The legendary guitarist James Burton, a pillar of his TCB band, once faced the king's wrath not for a false note, but because reportedly he was socializing too much with Colonel Parker. Elvis did not forgive even the suspicion of double-dealing. For him, a perfect note meant perfect devotion. The money? Musicians received huge fees, up to $15,000 a week in the 70s, but this money was not compensation, but golden chains. They were forced to endure his dictation, because losing the job with Elvis meant not just losing income, but being branded as not good enough for the king. Do you think this was just a star's whim? No, it was a system. But how exactly did Elvis use this fear to make musicians play against their will? And what did they do when the king was too sick to sing? Proof 2. False notes and silent collusion. Do you know that Elvis's musicians sometimes played perfectly not for the music, but to maintain his illusion? Elvis's perfectionism was so irrational that he demanded the impossible, and his musicians learned to live in constant fear. They had to know every chord, every movement of his hand by heart. If Elvis, tired or under the influence of drugs, missed an entry or came in off key, they were obliged to instantly and imperceptibly adjust to his mistake, never exposing him to the audience. This was an act of treacherous loyalty. It turned professional artists into actors, forced to play the role of ideal support for a deteriorating genius. Tell us, do you think Elvis's entourage, who kept silent about his condition, were his biggest enemies or his last friends? Write your opinion in the comments. The silence about his mistakes cost the musicians their pride. But do you know that one of his tantrums cost an entire team their job? We move on to the most shocking firing story in the history of rock and roll. Proof 3. The Dixie Tantrum and the Nighttime Massacre. One time, during a studio session, Elvis decided to record a country gospel song. And when the drummer couldn't reproduce the exact rhythm from his memory, a real catastrophe began. In the 1970s, as his addiction intensified, Elvis became unpredictable. The legendary incident of an entire section of musicians being fired after a performance in Las Vegas over a minor discrepancy in the song's execution. The decision was made single-handedly at 3 a.m. with no right to appeal. This was not a professional requirement, but a manifestation of maniacal control. The more irrational Elvis was, the more Colonel Parker could control him financially. Each of his angry outbursts, each firing, strengthened the walls of the golden cage, forcing others to fear and cling to their earnings. The firings were part of the game, but the main master of manipulation was the Colonel. He presented a bill for $2 million, and this bill became his insurance against the king. How exactly did this figure ruin Elvis's creativity? Proof 4. The Colonel's golden cage and financial blackmail. $2 million is not just money, but a noose around the neck. This was the price the king had to pay for freedom. At the peak of his career, Elvis dared to rebel. He wanted to fire the Colonel. In response, Colonel Tom Parker presented him with a financial bill that, by various estimates, amounted to over $2 million for allegedly covered expenses. Elvis didn't have that money. He found himself trapped. This was not creative collaboration, but a financial dictatorship. To pay off the debt, Elvis was forced to continue exhausting tours, forced to sing the same songs. His perfectionism towards the musicians was a projection of his own despair. If he couldn't control his life, he controlled every note. This became a trap with no exit, as Parker always demanded cash. Each unsuccessful tour only increased this unpaid debt, undermining the artist's psyche. $2 million was his sentence of life service under tyranny. You must subscribe to this channel now if you want to see how we will reveal the Colonel's financial secrets that turned Elvis into a slave. Don't miss the next investigations. Money. It was everywhere. But do you know that musicians sometimes received not checks, but gifts intended to stifle their indignation? Proof 5. Cadillacs as bribes and hiding the figures. Elvis was known for his generosity. He gave away Cadillacs and diamond watches. But this was not kindness, but an attempt to buy peace. Instead of constant salary increases, Elvis often gave his musicians and members of the Memphis Mafia expensive gifts, cars, jewelry. These gifts were great PR, but they were also a tool of control. This was an emotional investment that created even greater dependence and forced them to keep silent about his strange demands and problems. It was a way of hiding the real figures. Instead of transparent contract, a shiny Cadillac. Rumors circulated that musicians who tried to speak about his regime received a gift the next day. This was a signal. Take this, but keep quiet. One of his guitarists, Stan, received a pink Cadillac, although his weekly salary was deliberately underestimated by the Colonel. These gifts created a false sense of belonging to a family where fear actually reigned. The total value of Cadillacs he gave away in the 70s exceeded the $500,000 mark. Even more cynical was the fact that the Colonel forced Elvis to gift the Mafia cars that he himself bought wholesale at a discount. It was a brilliant scheme. Elvis demonstrated generosity, and Parker profited from the price difference. Many musicians, like guitarist John Wilkinson, openly said they felt like mercenaries, not part of team. Gifts bought silence. But how can you demand perfectionism when you can barely stand up yourself? Next, we will reveal the terrifying secret of his performances. Proof 6. Deadly schedule and sound doubles. Elvis performed in Las Vegas twice a night, 7 days a week, for a month. This is impossible. Colonel Parker demanded this devilish schedule to maximize his own profit. He owned 50% of the income. It was physically impossible to endure this, especially for Elvis, who was already addicted to drugs. His perfectionism turned into paranoia. He demanded that the musicians be his perfect double in sound, his energy double, while his body was falling apart. The TCB band musicians recalled that sometimes they played with such force that they practically carried the entire performance, while Elvis sang on autopilot. His demands for ideal purity of sound were a cry for help. He wanted the music to be perfect because he himself no longer was. In the 1970s, he had to give up to 60 concerts in 30 days in Vegas, which is physical abuse. This forced him to take increased doses of stimulants to get on stage and sedatives to fall asleep. His pianist, Tony Brown, was often forced to play for two to hide his lethargy. Everyone knew that on the Vegas stages, his perfectionism became a screen for his physical collapse. The musicians received clear instructions: play louder to hide the king's rasp. This musical ideal was just a tragic illusion for the audience. He demanded they play perfectly, but his ideal was just a mask. Which single instrument could he not tolerate and why? Proof 7. War with the saxophone and control over the timbre. The king of rock and roll could not tolerate the saxophone. And this is no accident. Elvis almost never used the saxophone in his later recordings and performances. Why? His voice was his crown, and the saxophone, especially when played by titans like Boots Randolph, created a competing, often more sexual and unpredictable timbre. His perfectionism here was a fight for the monopoly on emotion. Elvis subconsciously felt threatened. He could control the guitar or the piano, but the saxophone is pure, wild energy that he himself could no longer unleash. Therefore, his demands were simple: minimum jazz, maximum of his voice. This was an act of self-defense against his own aging, tired charisma. He believed the saxophone was too distracting, as his own entry onto the stage had to be the only shock. This limitation, imposed by perfectionism, cost his music the depth of funk and blues. Even in his early hits, he preferred the sharp sound of the guitar over the soft timbre of the brass instruments. Because of this, many arrangements sounded dry, as if something was missing. The saxophone, in his mind, was too unpredictable for his regime of ideal control. He even refused to cooperate with famous jazz musicians due to their indiscipline. Control of the voice is control of power. But do you know that he fired people even for trying to bring him joy? Proof 8. Firing for speeding up the tempo in the studio. The recording studio is no place for experiments. If Elvis didn't like how you breathed, you were out. His perfectionism turned studio sessions into a minefield. His keyboardist, David Briggs, recalled that Elvis could stop a recording if he felt someone was not in the right mood. One musician was fired simply for trying to speed up the tempo in a song to give it more energy. Elvis considered this a betrayal of his artistic vision, although, in reality, it was just a different opinion. Elvis's decisions were final, like a verdict. The firing cost the person $12,000 in lost earnings for a month's work. This was the price of initiative. He demanded that all recordings sound exactly as perfect as they were in his head, leaving no room for interpretation. There is a famous case where he terminated a contract with a backup vocalist who stood out too much on the recording. This studio dictate suffocated creative potential and turned geniuses into robots. Even the slightest human errors caused uncontrollable outbursts of anger in him. His paranoia forced him to demand 50 takes for one song, exhausting the musicians to the limit. Studio musicians called his demands the tyranny of inspiration, where a perfect note was more important than any emotion. Any improvisation or variation was considered a personal insult to the king. This led to many later albums sounding artificial and soulless. The price of initiative is high, but the price of betrayal? It was measured in millions. How did Colonel Tom Parker use Elvis to pay off his own car debt? Proof 9. The Las Vegas catastrophe and car debts. What do the Colonel's poker table and Elvis's stage have in common? Everything. Colonel Tom Parker was a compulsive gambler. Rumor has it that his colossal gambling debts in Las Vegas were one of the main reasons why he so zealously kept Elvis in Vegas on constant, exhausting contracts. Elvis was not just singing. He was a living collateral for his manager's debts. The Colonel received 50% of the income, which was unprecedented for such an artist. But this figure was only the tip of the iceberg. The king's true debt to Vegas was not financial, but physical and mental. His demands on the musicians, his perfectionism, were simply a way to drown out the pain of realizing that he was just a highly paid slave working for another man's card debts. Some sources claim that the Colonel's debts to the Hilton Casino in the 70s could have reached $30 million. That is why the Colonel categorically forbade him from touring Europe, where he could not control him and his income 100%. Elvis performed at the Hilton International, where the Colonel had an office that was essentially his poker headquarters. The king's huge income was the only guarantee that Parker would not be kicked out of Vegas for debt. Every Elvis show was a financial lifeline for his manager, not a triumph of music. The Colonel literally sat in the dressing room, taking calls from loan sharks, while Elvis sang "Love Me Tender." Slavery, money, betrayal. But the last proof is the most painful. Who was the only musician Elvis was genuinely afraid to fire? And why was he his curse? Proof 10. The Curse of Jerry Scheff and the Fear of Solitude. Bassist Jerry Scheff is not just a musician. He was Elvis's last anchor to reality. Jerry Scheff was one of the few who could openly say no to Elvis or offer criticism. He was so crucial to the sound of the TCB band that Elvis, despite his perfectionism, did not dare to touch him. This was the only exception that proved the rule. Elvis could fire anyone, but he was afraid of losing the ideal quality of his sound. He feared that without Scheff, his musical empire would collapse, and his solitude would become absolute. His perfectionism was not a love of music. It was a paranoid fear of losing control over the only thing keeping him afloat. The illusion of perfection in a world where everything around him was already decaying from greed and betrayal. Scheff was known for being able to refuse a gift, unlike others, if he felt it was dishonest. His bass lines were what gave a unique, funky foundation to Elvis's later rock hits, and the King realized this. He was the only one who, according to memoirs, could look Elvis directly in the eye without fear of anger. It was Scheff who helped other musicians when Elvis fell into studio tantrums. Elvis respected Scheff because he was a professional who could not be bought with a Cadillac. This respect was his last connection to true creativity, not illusion. His presence was a guarantee that the TCB band would not turn into an orchestra of the doomed. Scheff, unlike the Memphis Mafia, always put music above personal gain. His ideal was honest, which Elvis found nowhere else. Elvis Presley was a king who died in his own kingdom, built on sand, and his perfectionism was merely a psychological shield against the realization that his entourage, including his hired musicians, were with him only for money. His final verdict is the tragedy of a genius imprisoned in a golden cage, where a perfectly played note was more important than his life. This is not the end, but only the beginning. In the next video, we will show you previously unknown details about his last day, and also reveal why his fiancée, Linda Thompson, fled Graceland and what 7 dramatic facts from Elvis Presley's life led to his death. Don't risk losing the most exclusive and shocking materials about the King. Subscribe and you will get access to an investigation that will rewrite the history of rock and roll.